And be humble. The definition of a crisis is you'll have imperfect information. Don't pretend you know everything. And communicate with a tone that acknowledges that things might change, because they always do in a crisis, and they never go quite how you think.
Crisis communications. We know it's scary, but we do need to talk about it. As a founder, few things are more terrifying than bad press. But as unlikely as it might seem, you need to have a plan. Because if something goes wrong, simply wishing it away won't work. And at the same time, you can't panic. For a step-by-step guide on crisis communications, we called up Michael Hoare at Kex, a global strategic communications firm. Michael has deep experience in crisis handling and preparedness, national security, and geopolitics. Suffice it to say, we couldn't think of anyone better to turn to for advice. We started our chat by discussing how to know if you're experiencing a crisis that justifies communication.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it starts really with your definition of a crisis. And we did training in government that I led for leaders of comms teams in a crisis, and we would always start with that question: what is a crisis? And it usually came out with something like a situation where the scale, the impact, the level of risk, and the speed of escalation mean you can't manage it successfully with business as usual resources, capabilities, and processes. So by definition, a crisis, you can't handle it on your own. You can have imperfect information, and it really matters. So other people are going to be critical to the outcome. And that means comms is almost always central to your approach to a crisis, whether that's internal comms with key customers, or larger scale comms like engaging media. Well, we'd love it if it was possible. Lots of us who've worked on crises would love to be able to know when the next one's coming. Some of them you can see them building. I worked in government on the comms around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we could see that coming. For a company, it might be rumbling customer dissatisfaction, and sometimes there are events that can spark a crisis. It might be a court case or an employee tribunal, and those you can see coming if you've got good networks, you're listening to your people, and you're really paying attention to the signals. But some crises, they just come out of the blue. Ransomware attack, other types of cyber incident often just come at you. And the key there is to have a general level of readiness, so you know how you're going to respond to crises that you haven't foreseen. Yeah, and I think the decision on whether and how to communicate comes back to your business objectives, and how are those impacted by different audiences? Which audiences are critical to delivery, and therefore you need to reach out to them when things are going wrong. Sometimes that can be really disciplined and focused, like in a cyber incident. For a B2B business, you're quite often being very disciplined about your comms, but it might be much more wide scale. If you have a retail product and you're the subject of a disinformation campaign, you might see yourself wanting to communicate at much greater scale. Usually, the customers and those most affected will want to hear from you first rather than hear it secondhand, but it is a case-by-case decision, and it's worth really thinking about the factors involved and thinking about comms and how you're going to approach it early on. Yes, definitely. Communications is all about having an impact on audiences. And so for different audiences, you want different types of messaging. But that said, the core of the message shouldn't be different. It should be consistent. And you should think about how your messaging to one audience might end up reaching another audience. And a classic example of that is internal comms, where in a crisis, it's hugely important to engage your people, speak to them honestly about what is happening. But you also need to be conscious of ways and how that might also reach external audiences. So definitely different ways of going about it, but be consistent. One thing in government that we found really helpful when sort of thinking about comms in a crisis with the Krebs principles, which say to your audiences what you know, what you don't know, what you're doing about it, what they should do about it, and what they should expect to happen next, and when you're going to come back to them with more information. And those principles are helpful for all audiences in all crises, really. Yes to both questions, if you like. Yes to taking a breath And I had one of the best media handlers who I work with in UK government was a heavy smoker. And we would often be in the middle of a crisis and the press office would be going crazy and he would go out for a cigarette and he'd come back 5-10 minutes later and he'd have had an idea about what we should do, or he'd have had greater clarity of thought about how we approach that crisis. And I often think of that in a crisis and try and carve out for myself some time. The more hectic the crisis is, the more you need that time to take a breath, as you put it. It's an ironic expression when I'm using the example of someone smoking cigarettes. But yes, to that sort of pause moment to have a think about what you're doing. And yes, as well, to sometimes the answer isn't communicating. As I said earlier, often in a crisis, you do need to communicate with some audience and you will be dependent on other people for the outcome. But sometimes it's keeping it internal. Sometimes it's being very focused about who you're reaching. And sometimes now might not be the right moment to do it. In a legal case, for example, you might find it's better to communicate at a different point in the process. So yes to both. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting case study, and we looked at that and assessed our views on the impact of that. I think core to that is press coverage in and of itself is not a crisis, and you shouldn't really be, as far as possible, be driven by the press coverage. So if an issue is affecting customers and making for a more negative experience for them, then it might be a crisis. But I think in that case, and in all communications, the issue is to think about your audiences. What are they thinking about? What's troubling them? And talk to them about what matters most to them, which often isn't press coverage. So I think back to the early example, always worth taking a breath, thinking about the audiences that you're trying to reach and considering the impact it might have on them and speaking to the issues that matter to them. Yeah, I think the core of the advice for me would be around think ahead, try and predict where the crisis is going. Develop your networks, ideally before the crisis. One of our clients loves to say, make friends before you need them, and it is so true. Establish a narrative with those networks about your organization, what you can do for them. Build trust, which takes time, but reputation and a clear set of values are your sort of biggest, your strongest armor, if you like, when you're under attack in a crisis. When you are communicating externally, be human, think about the impact on other people, be honest, and set out, as we've described with the Krebs principles, what you know and what you don't know, and be humble. The definition of a crisis is you'll have imperfect information. Don't pretend you know everything, and communicate with a tone that acknowledges that things might change, because they always do in a crisis, and they never go quite how you think. But above all, in terms of preparing for the crisis, make sure that the behavior of everyone involved in the company withstands external scrutiny. Make sure your team understand that, your partners understand that. It doesn't matter how big or small a company it is, that is central to its ability to withstand and ultimately come out stronger from a crisis. Yeah, breaking it down into sort of the fundamentals, I would say have a plan and test it. And start with the test it. Testing it can mean anything from an exercise or simulation through to just really gaming it out. It could be on your drive to work, thinking this is how we thought we'd approach this issue, but would it really work? So do make sure you really test it. For the plan itself, combine the general and the specific. Think about a few specific scenarios that would be high impact, high likelihood for your business. Just think through those threads and the various elements of that. Really helps sort of bring home how you respond in a crisis, but also think about the general, because you won't be able to predict every crisis that hits you. Think about how do we resource a crisis? How would information flow work? How would the decision-making processes work? And the last thing about the plan is mix the external and the internal. So some of it is about the external risks, the audiences you'd want to reach. How do you influence them? Which partners would you be working with, etc. And some of it is about the internal. What's your decision-making process like? As I mentioned, who is on your crisis response team, and that should really be driven by the crisis itself and the business needs, but do have someone who's thinking about comms in that team. What are the obstacles? And sometimes we in crisis preparedness work, we've come up to some really specific things like time differences of people who need to take a decision together being in different places, or the guy that has the password for the website left last week and no one knows how to update the website. Really small things like that can come out when you just game it out a bit. Think about where you're going to get your information from, and how will your culture work in a crisis, and how the sort of the fissures that you might have in your culture and business as usual, but you can survive, suddenly might get exposed in a crisis. And then thinking about that, I think, is a core part of planning for and preparing for a crisis. So crisis comm support can be expensive because it comes at a moment where it matters. And if you are in a crisis and you have that feeling, as we talked about at the beginning, that you can't, it's of a scale that means you can't handle it on its own, then do look for help and bring in support, because they can be incredibly difficult moments, and what may be small decisions can end up having a significant impact. It is almost always cheaper to prepare, and we see this with clients going into crises, that those with a plan and with some level of sensitization in their teams, the decisions they're going to need to take and how they're going to need to work, can really help and can mitigate the cost quite a bit. And ultimately, on preparation, that comes down to if you take the mitigatable cost of the crisis, the elements you could have saved yourself if you prepared, and multiply them by the likelihood of the crisis happening, is that bigger or smaller than the cost of preparing for the crisis? I mean, it sort of boils down to that. And you can calibrate the cost of preparing, because you can do anything from a full-scale exercise through to thinking through some of the trickier issues, and maybe getting a bit, bouncing some ideas off someone external. So there's a sort of range, but it's really thinking about how much could this cost us if we're not ready for it, versus and how can we keep the cost of preparing for it as sort of as cost-effective a level as possible. Yeah, and I'd say working with clients on crises, you often see brilliant responses. And I was involved in a crisis recently where I didn't have to do a huge amount because the client was well prepared, and they did a fantastic job. And often people do really come into their own in a crisis, but people do also make mistakes, as the question implies. And I think of them as being on a spectrum, and quite often crisis response is about balance. So you can have communicate too much, communicate too little, as one example of a spectrum where you can make a mistake on either end. There's overreacting to the situation as it happens versus burying your head in the sand and pretending it's not happening. There's people can be in the wrong end of that spectrum, thinking too much about internal engagement versus external, and again, people sort of sit on different places on that spectrum. Relying too much on your own perspective and thinking too much about that and not about how others might see it, and getting a diversity of perspectives can be a problem. And one which is a bit sad, but it's true, is hope. Hope can be a problem in crisis preparedness and crisis handling, either because you recognize that might happen, but you just really hope it doesn't, or because you hope that the crisis is over, and you keep hoping that tomorrow we're going to wake up and it's going to all have been fixed and things will go away. And don't fall for the hope on the preparedness. Do prepare for high impact, high likelihood scenarios, and on the hope that things might be over soon. I mean, they will be over, and the crises do finish, and companies and organizations come out of them the other side often stronger if they've handled them well. But do base that on evidence and support, and where you need it, expert external advice.